my name is Laleh Khalili and I'm the author of Sinews of War and Trade, which has just been published with Verso. What I want to do today is to show 5 images from 2 container ship journeys I took in 2015 and 2016, and to discuss what the images actually represent. Each of these images are in one way or the other showing aspects of maritime transport today, which are of great significance, but there's also interesting stories around them. So what I'll be doing now is going through these images. These images each have a caption, and the caption says something about the time that I took them. The first of these images is one that everybody that I know that has traveled by container ship has a photograph of. It is of in this instance, a 40-foot equivalent container ship with the word capital written across it. Now, Capital is actually a container transport company from East Asia. And this picture I took when on my first journey on a CMA CGM ship, a container ship. And this enormous container was sitting right outside of my cabin. Now, the reason that this is a particularly interesting image, not aside from the fact that it has the word capital on it, which is of course a play on capitalism, is the fact that we know that these 20-foot equivalent containers, or 40-foot equivalent containers, are actually one of the most significant technological innovations in the 20th century for the transport of goods. Because what they did was they not only standardized the different ways of loading cargo ships so that they work more like Lego pieces, they fit into each other very well, but they are also intermodal, which means that they can be easily lifted off a ship, put on top of a truck or on a train, and transported in that way. So these containers are for that reason quite significant. But what also they portend is a transformation in the regimes of labor aboard cargo ships, because before the coming of these container ships, what we would see was somewhere between, I don't know, dozens up to 100 stevedores arriving with their winches and cranes and various other kinds of equipment, and would try to unload cargo from the ships that were on pallets or in boxes or in bags. But what the container did was to actually streamline people out of jobs, essentially, to reduce the power of stevedores and dockers, because what it did was it allowed machinery to be introduced. So in some senses, the container is quite a significant maritime transport element, tool, vehicle, but it is also quite a significant and important moment or vehicle for the transformation of regimes of labor. It's despite the fact that it's not super high-tech, despite the fact that it is now a kind of furniture, like a furniture of our cities, it is probably the single most important element in the automation of the maritime industry, even more than computers, I would say, because I think that in some ways it has really streamlined the way that a container ship could connect to other forms, or a ship could connect to other forms of transport. The second image that I want to show you is of the engine room of the ship that I was on. Now, Alan Sekula, in his wonderful fish story, has a lot of really fascinating stuff to say about the engine rooms. But one of the things that he says is that the engine thrums like the beat of a heart on methamphetamines. And there is a truth to that. The engine rooms of these container ships are extraordinary cathedrals to the power of the engine. These are cylinders that you can see operating, and these cylinders move a shaft that essentially moves the ship. And this very large crankshaft is about 1 meter wide. And if it breaks or if it stops working, essentially the ship stops working. But there's a lot of other machine elements around the ship that are quite as important. And what is fascinating is that this incredibly complex machinery, this incredibly sophisticated engine, which has many, many moving parts, when at sea has to be repaired by essentially artisans who work with tools that we would be familiar with from any kind of workshop, hammers and screwdrivers and wrenches and various other kinds of tools, welding and whatnot, to fix the bits of the machinery. So in some senses, the skills that are required to maintain the ship at sea are extraordinary. And in a way, if we saw the container ship as being something that innovated towards further automation, towards further removal of laborers from the scene of loading and unloading of ships, the engine room in some ways tells us how difficult that automation will be and the limits of that automation, because on a long distance journey, the repair of the engine of the ship is not something that can happen in an automated way. So in some senses, this engine room, incredibly hot, incredibly dangerous. It is. You have to be wearing heavy steel-toed boots and overalls that prevent your skin from getting burnt on the hot machinery, and you have to wear a helmet all the way through there. But this incredible engine room also, is a sense, shows the limits of automation. At least with the technology that we have today, it would be impossible to maintain this the engine room without the help of humanity. So this is, it's also, the engine room is one of the most fascinating parts of the ship. Those who retain it are very proud of their labor and of their skills. And so in some senses, it is quite a fascinating element of the ship. It's in the bowels of it. It's not obvious, but without it, obviously, we would not have the trade that we have today. The third image that I want to show you is from my second journey. And this one is of the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal, which essentially was dug up, it was a ditch that had at some time in ancient history had a possibility actually of movement through it, but it had dried up. The Suez Canal was dug up in the 1860s, and in sort of the high period, or the sort of high period of imperialism at the end of the 19th century, it became a conduit for the imperial powers of Europe towards Asia and Africa, East Africa, and its control and nationalization had led first to the essentially colonization of Egypt by Britain in the 1880s, when the debts for the canal could not be paid, and its nationalization in the 1950s by Gamal Abdel Nasser led to a tripartite war against Egypt by the British, the French, and the Israelis. Now, the canal is an extraordinarily important conduit for trade because it shortens a journey from Asia to Europe by anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes longer, depending on the route of the ship. But it does require the ships to pay a fee to the canal, and so it is often the shipping companies often have to balance the cost of the fees against the speed with which they need to get their cargo to Asia or from Asia. And in fact, one of the interesting things today, right now at this moment of the pandemic, and with the incredibly low prices of oil, is that many shipping companies that are seeing a massive drop in demand for their goods are actually, and a massive drop also in the price of fuel, are actually changing their journeys to go around the Cape of Good Hope, adding about 3 to 4 weeks to their journeys so that they could save on the cost of traveling through the canal. Now, the canal also has been quite a significant, has seen a quite a significant transformation in the most recent years, with the government of General El-Sisi trying to sort of create an infrastructure project in the image of the old nationalist kind of mega projects which said something of sort of the pride of the nation. And so with financing from the Saudis, a second channel was dug for around 2/3 of the length of the canal, the southern 2/3 length of the canal. And what that means is that the canal is now two ways, and that means that instead of having to wait for a southbound cargo convoy to sort of finish going all the way through the canal before a northbound convoy can come up, now those two convoys can actually pass each other in the bottom third of or bottom 2/3 of the canal. And when the global maritime trade was at its height, obviously this was quite an incredibly useful thing to have, because it sped up crossing through the canal by somewhere between 18 to 24 hours. However, with the slowdown in the global trade, and with many of the ships routing their ships around the Cape of Good Hope, the canal has seen a multi-million-dollar drop in its monthly fees. So this land-bound or if you want, amphibian structure is incredibly important, not only in facilitating imperialism, but also as a conduit for continued global trade. And it is an extraordinarily fascinating moment to go through the canal, because as you're going through the canal, on the African side, you have this vibrant green area with a train line running along it. But on the Sinai side, it is arid, it is dry, and you can still see the remnants of past wars, including rusted out tanks. And so I think in a way, the canal's portion of the journey was one of the most fascinating bits of the journey for me. The next image that I want to show is at Khor Fakkan port, which is on the Gulf of Oman. Khor Fakkan is part of the Emirate of Sharjah. And what we are seeing here is a dock worker coming aboard the container ship and unlashing the containers from the ship and unlocking the corners of the containers from those below. Now, the reason that I provided this image is because if you look at it, the guy who's doing this job was an incredibly lithe, graceful, and incredibly competent and very efficient, very quick worker, but he's not wearing a harness, he's not wearing any safety gears, and he was walking across these containers, which are more than 100 meters off the ground, and so in a way, or around 100 meters off the ground, and so it is in a way a kind of a terrifying spectacle, because if he falls down, it's it could be quite deadly. And so I think that this image to me was representative again of that kind of a tension between automation and the use of labor, when the use of labor is so cheap as to not provide a financial or economic reason for automation of this particular job. This to me was also fascinating because, of course, one of the concerns of those who write critically about maritime and shipping industries is the proliferation of what is called ghost ports, ports in which humans have been essentially left out of the equation. And although those ghost ports, a fully automated port, exist in places like Rotterdam and to some extent Antwerp and other places, I think that as long as workers on the docks can be kept docile and their wages could be pressured further down, pressurized towards being lower and lower, then in that sense, automation does not necessarily make sense. Often these kinds of attempts at automating ports emerges in response to having very militant unions that try to organize and to try to push the wages up. Finally, the last image that I want to talk about is about securitization of ports, about the introduction of security measures in various ports. This one is a picture from Jebel Ali port, which is the largest container port in the Middle East, and the only container port from anywhere else in the world, from that other than Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, on the top 10 lists of the world's ports. Even Rotterdam, which is an enormous port, appears at number 11, whereas Jebel Ali is number 8. Now, Jebel Ali, which is in Dubai, is also one of the most important transshipment ports in the world. And transshipment means that goods come in and then they're distributed via the sea or by land to other locations in the hinterland or in nearby countries. And Jebel Ali does this function. But what was interesting about this image to me was as our ship came towards the port is the extent to which this particular port has introduced security measures that essentially protect the business of the port from possible gazing eyes, curiosity of bystanders, from the possibility also of stowaways coming on board, or indeed the possibility of those who are aboard the ship, the workers who are aboard the ship, coming onto the port and not going back on the ship. And so what you see is along the length of the berth where the ship will be tying up or parking up, if you will, you'll see a barbed wire electrified fence with gates which require identity cards with chips in them in order for the workers to go onto them. And again, in addition to the elements of technological innovation, to the suppression of labor activity, and to the kinds of imperial interests, one can also add these kinds of security measures that try to separate different segments of workers from one another, that in some senses solidify the borders through which even the cargo passes, and which show us the way that surveillance mechanisms function incredibly strongly also on ports. These surveillance mechanisms are again important, not only because of the stowaways or workers coming on board, but also because of the way that there could be external scrutiny of the way that these shipping companies work, external scrutiny of the way that the dockers work, external scrutiny of the way sailors work, and the addition of these security mechanisms in some senses tries to prevent these forms of scrutiny or accountability. Now, I have many, many more pictures of this journey, but I've shown these 5 pictures because I think that, again, in some senses, they were representative of the 2 journeys that I took. And there are lots more that I actually talk about in regards to these journeys. And I weave them in with the histories of these kinds of transformations in my book, Sinews of War and Trade. And I hope that you would be interested in reading that. Thank you very much.